Solidarity, comrades. I'm so happy to have you here today. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Xinhai Revolution, also known as the 1911 Revolution or the Chinese Republican Revolution. But before we get into that, I want to mention a few things. One, I'm very excited to announce that very soon I will be publishing an interview that I had with a branch secretary of the Communist Party of India Marxist, a branch secretary in Kerala, which is the lowest echelon of leadership within the CPI Marxist, and them and their cadre, operate as a branch in a certain region. Oh my gosh, my hair. It's always something. I've been working. But, so yeah, and we're going to discuss the CPIM, Kerala, the Kerala, what did they call it? The Kerala system, the Kerala model. Speak about the LDF and other very interesting things. And this is a person on the ground, doing it right now in a communist-controlled part of India. So it's very, very interesting. So look out for that. It's coming out very soon. And, just keep a lookout for me on other comrades' platforms, because you may be seeing me there soon as well. So let's get into this. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911. What is it? Everyone knows about the revolution that established the People's Republic of China in the year 1949. But what happened in 1911? We need to look at a little bit of history of China. Since around 300 or 350, between that BC, until 1911, China had been ruled by a cycle of dynasties, starting with the Qin dynasty and ending with the Qing dynasty. And there's many in between, Han being the most famous, and it's where the Han people get their name from. So what happened in China is very different to the sort of feudalism that happened in the West that was very hereditary and, blood right and stuff like that. Well, where the Chinese leaders sourced their power was much like the absolutists of the later periods, from divine right, from the mandate of heaven. And heaven in, the Taoist tradition isn't a place, it's an entity, sort of that. It's really hard to explain Taoism. I'm not an expert myself, but it's basically an entity, and if you get the mandate of heaven, then your family, your dynasty has the mandate to rule the people, and generally the people will, throughout Chinese history, follow this dynasty very loyally, because they also had, philosophies like Moism, legalism, Confucianism. And this was a very, collective sort of thinking where serving the state was, so ideal. So when the state had the mandate of heaven, for the most part, the people were very, very willing to follow these people, especially peasants that were more spiritual and religious. But then we move on to the Qing dynasty, the final dynasty. And, it was looking like another cycle, except for the end of this, when the mandate of heaven was, sort of revoked from the Qing dynasty, there wasn't any sentiment to replace it with another dynasty, but a new, modern 20th century democracy, a national democracy, and something that the Chinese people had never experienced. Sort of trying to end that cycle of the mandate, the cycle of feudalism and oppression of the people. And the groups that arose during this time were the precursors to the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party. And it was founded under people, under very left-wing figures that had their traditions in the May the 4th movement and anti-imperialism and national liberation ideals. And that's why they were nationalists, purely for the ideal of national liberation. And this was all surrounded by a figure named Sun Yat-Sen, known more in the West as Sun Yat-Sen. His Mandarin name was Sun Zhongshan. Zhongshan is a name that he took, which means middle mountain. It's a representation of a pillar of strength. In the center, is sort of that same thing that, Western revolutionaries did, and a lot of Russian revolutionaries did, taking on aliases and new names. So these people allied around Sun Yat-sen, who was a nationalist, a socialist, and an anti-imperialist, and he came up with the idea of the three principles of the Chinese people. And it wasn't till, he didn't live very long, unfortunately, and it wasn't, and after his death, that was when the KMT was taken over by the right wing under Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang was, the one who established the illegal government in Taiwan and all that. But in 1911, the KMT were supported by revolutionaries and left-wingers and communists, because the communists didn't have a party until the 20s. And even when they formed the party at first, they still supported the KMT in the War of National Liberation against Japanese and Western colonialism. So when we look at 1911, we have a lot of disparate forces, not just the national revolutionaries, but we also have warlords, and other Republicans that aren't so tied to the nationalism, but more to the Western liberal democracy style of governance, and all these disparate forces, sort of coalesced together in this moment to overthrow the Qing dynasty. But it was started, the spark, because the tension had been building up for over a century. They called it the Century of Shame, and this was sort of a fight back at that Century of Shame, of foreign dominance. And so after events like May the 4th movement and everything like that, these in Wuhan there was an uprising of nationalist Republicans, anti-monarchists, and this sparked the entire revolution, and it lasted for about a year when they fought against the Qing forces, but they defeated them. And the Qing dynasty was overthrown forever, and a large part of the country was controlled by the KMT, but other massive swaths were controlled by, the warlords, who had been gaining prominence during the Century of Shame, as the Qing dynasty had, became a vacuum in a lot of the hinterlands and of the country. These warlords rose up, to fill that void of power. And so you had these reactionary warlords, one of them named Yuan Shikai. And this guy, well, he sort of co-opted the movement, and he was the next president after Sun Yat-sen died. But, his secret ambitions were to restore, and make himself the emperor, form a new dynasty. And he crowned himself the emperor, did the harvest ceremony at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, tried to make it all official, but this was outwardly rejected by the revolutionary masses, and they overthrew them. And during this chaos post Xinhai Revolution, that is when Japan stepped in and started colonizing these places. And the Xinhai Revolution and the May the 4th movement that subsequently happened after it, these people were the same people that a few years later, after World War II, combated the takeover of Shandong. That was a mass student uprising, but after that, it was so much more power went into the anti-imperialist movement. And when the Japanese started fighting, aggressively taking land in the 30s, that is when, what had happened is that Japan had been asserting their influence and everything, and just the KMT at that time, who were still supported by the Communist Party, were just trying to get the country stable and wrestle power from the pro-monarchists and the warlords. And during that time, the Japanese started designing on their plans and the footholds they had in China. And in 1927, the KMT betrayed the communists and attacked them. And that started a civil conflict. And it wasn't until the Japanese full invasion of China in the 30s that they stopped their fighting and formed a united front against, Japanese imperialism. And it wasn't until they defeated Japan that they resumed conflict with each other until its subsequent end, officially in 1950. But the PRC was proclaimed just at the end of the year before, in October. So, in conclusion, the Xinhai Revolution was an ending of an old cycle, of an old way, and an ushering in of new ways of thinking. Ushering in ideas of anti-imperialism, republicanism, socialism, anti-colonialism, and, democracy, and, rights for workers. These were things that, had been strived for in China for a long time, but been brutally repressed by reactionary forces. And this time they had the upper hand and they won. And after that, and the war between the nationalists and the communists, the war against the Japanese invaders, and then later the conclusion of that war, all of the revolutionary fervor that came after the Xinhai Revolution was, that it was the first domino. The Xinhai Revolution was the first domino. And I think it's important for a lot of us to look at that, because, it was at similar times in history as the Bolshevik Revolution, and similar times in history as the Spartacist uprising, and Bela Kun in Hungary, and the Bavarian Soviet. This was happening all around the world, and the revolution in Mexico, the revolution in Mexico is against autocracy as well. So this was a moment in history where the first domino of modern revolution started, and I think it's important we look at all these movements that affected the world that we live in today. So that's what I have to say about the Xinhai Revolution. If you have any questions about specific people or certain events or any future videos, let me know. Please subscribe to these great channels, these comrades. Ewoks Unhinged, fantastic comrade. The Red Lettuce Podcast, amazing. Mason Steiner, a great comrade. Right now he is working on an iron ore ship, but he will return later this year. But he has a backlog of amazing content, so definitely check that out. Check out Denki King, great comrade, known him for a while. I know all of y'all probably know him as well. Red Comrades in China is, they scrapped some of their old work and are coming out with some new stuff too, so watch out for that. And remember to like, subscribe, share this with your comrades. And yeah, thank you so much. Solidarity, comrades. Goodbye.